Hello, class. Chapter 10, definitely one of the most important chapters for the semester because, again, Chapter 10 really talks about, I'll call it the meat and potatoes of what happens, in contract enforcement to, where both sides make sure that the other is following the contract. And obviously the way that, either side can make sure that if they feel like they're being treated differently or the other side is not following the contract, they can file what we call a ULP, an unfair labor practice with the government. So that's kind of what Chapter 10 is all about. ULPs, unfair labor practices, are basically actions taken that by either side that violate the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, which we learned about earlier in the semester. So if either side violates NLRA, then the other side can file a ULP. Pages 360 and 361 give a good overview of what that process looks like and what are some things that could be ULP. So make sure you study pages 360 and 361, which gives a really good overview. One of the bigger things, that often gets discussed is what we call the 24-hour rule. And this prohibits either side from making speeches on company time to assemblies of workers within 24 hours of an election. So, in the old days, what you'd see is, right before an election, right before, the day before, either side would give these great big speeches and mandatory meetings, where they would, basically say why their side was right, the other side was wrong. And sometimes they were doing things, I won't bore you with those details, but they were doing things that, could really heavily influence things. So the government put in this 24-hour rule that 24 hours before an election, neither side can use company time. Now they can do it on their off time, but they can't use company time to make big speeches, to workers to try to convince them one way or the other. Again, the 24-hour rule. If you go to table 10-1, it's called organizational campaign. That's a really good table I want you to look at. It gives you an overview about what is a ULP and what is not a ULP, because oftentimes, some things can be very similar and kind of, runs that borderline between the two. So again, as usual, I don't expect you to memorize, exactly, what is ULP and what is not. I won't ask you a question on the exam, like tell me all the things that are ULPs and things that are not. I wouldn't do that on an exam. But I think it's important for you to kind of get a general idea of when either the union or management does file a ULP, what is it, the types of things that they tend to be doing, and things that happen that don't rise to that level. So make sure you study table 10-1. And generally, it involves around what we call concerted activity, which is any legitimate action taken by employees to further their interests, such as wages, hours, and working conditions. Again, those are usually the key three things: wages, hours, and terms and conditions or working conditions of employment. So, as a general rule, management can't bar employees from talking about those things or sending emails about those things or discussing it on their break time or even outside the office. Those are things that are protected by the government. What we call concerted activities. So make sure you understand what that concept is. And obviously, as we've discussed in previous chapters, one of a union's strongest things that they can do to kind of move forward their interest is to do is to call a strike. And generally strikes are okay in any given situation, but there are four types of what we call illegal strikes. And again, you don't have to memorize what exactly each one does, but I think it's a good idea to take a look at what are the four different types of illegal strikes that a union can do. And then if they do perform any of those four, management can file an unfair labor practice against them to prevent them from doing that. So make sure you understand the four types of illegal strikes. Because of all these things that have kind of gone on over the years, they've created what we call the Weingarten rule. It's named after the person who created it. Weingarten basically means a union employee has the right to request the presence of a union official during a meeting with management if the meeting may involve discipline. So that way, the employee feels protected, and it keeps the union, kind of involved with, what are some potentially disciplinary actions being taken against their members. Now, an employee can certainly decline to have, somebody there. That's not a problem, but if the employee is going to a meeting with management and they could potentially be disciplined for it, then they have the right to ask somebody from the union to be present there with them, and management cannot say no to that. So it's called the Weingarten rule, and it's very, very, very common, especially in very heavily unionized, like manufacturing and things along those lines. So make sure you do know the Weingarten rule. And kind of like table 10-1 that we talked about just a second ago, table 10-4 talks about protected concerted activities. And again, it lists kind of two columns: what are ULPs and what are not ULPs. So make sure you kind of understand the differences between those. So that, again, just like Table 10-1, Table 10-4 does a good job of breaking down what is and what isn't. So make sure you kind of understand that table. If you remember earlier in the semester, I mentioned the idea of secondary boycotts. The idea that if your company's, you're striking against your company and they sell, whatever product to Walmart, you can't go stand in front of Walmart and hold a picket sign and say, my company makes this, we're striking against them, so don't go buy a Walmart. That's what they call a secondary boycott. Again, I mentioned it earlier in the semester, but your book now actually talks about secondary boycott. So again, want to emphasize how important that concept is. Well, finally, the last concept for Chapter 10 that I want you to know is the idea of what we call a duty to bargain in good faith. Essentially what that means is both sides have a duty to come to a bargaining session and I'll say not waste the other person's time. Actually genuinely having discussions and wanting to try to reach a type of agreement. So what a company or a union can't do is come to the session and just sit there and read and ignore and play on their phones and, talk about the baseball score from last night, things along those lines. They have to actively be engaged in talking about terms and wages and conditions of employment, and not talking about just stuff that has no relevance. Of course they can bring anything they want up, and again, neither side is under any obligation to agree with the other side. Just because you keep rejecting proposals from the other side doesn't mean that you're bargaining in bad faith. But again, the idea is that you will come to the table and you will make a genuine effort to at least attempt to come to a resolution with the other side. The idea of attempt to bargain in good faith. And you see a ton of ULPs filed in this area by both sides claiming the other side is not doing that. So again, make sure you understand the duty to bargain in good faith. So, all right, everybody, that's Chapter 10. Thanks so much for your attention, and we'll talk soon.